Hello, I'm Esther Gitu-Ewart. It's Thursday, June 29th. This is Africa 54. A court of appeal squashes London's plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda, saying the country is unsafe. Britain's Prime Minister says he will seek an appeal. Nigeria introduces a new way for children facing economic hardships to continue learning. And in Kenya, more than 100 traders sue the government for allowing Chinese-owned businesses to undercut their prices. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. A British court ruled that Rwanda is an unsafe country for London to deport asylum seekers, delivering a blow to the Conservative administration's pledge to stop migrants making risky journeys across the English Channel. Paul Ndiho has more.
In a 2-1 ruling, the Court of Appeal judges said Rwanda could not be considered a safe third country where migrants could be sent. Speaking during a session of the Court of Appeal, Lord Barnett, the Lord Chief Justice, said there is a real risk that persons sent to Rwanda will be returned to their home countries, where they faced persecution or inhumane treatment, even if they have valid asylum claims.
Rwanda is not a safe third country. That conclusion is founded on the evidence which was before the High Court that Rwanda's system for deciding asylum claims was, in the period up to the conclusion of the Rwanda Agreement, inadequate. The court is unanimous in accepting that the assurances given by the Rwandan government were made in good faith and were intended to address any defects in the asylum process. However, the majority believes that the evidence does not establish that the necessary changes had by then been reliably effected, or would have been at the time of the proposed removals. In consequence, sending anyone to Rwanda would constitute a breach of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which Parliament has required the government to comply with.
UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he fundamentally disagrees with the Court of Appeal's ruling and his government will appeal to the Supreme Court. Earlier this month, he pleaded to stop the boats, a reference to the overcrowded vessels that make the journey from northern France, carrying migrants who hope to live in the UK. The Rwandan government also took issue with the ruling, saying Rwanda is one of the safest countries in the world. The UK and Rwandan governments agreed more than a year ago that some migrants who arrive in the UK as stowaways or on small boats would be sent to Rwanda, where their asylum claims would be processed. But a European Court of Human Rights ruling blocked the plan last June. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Zambia's debt to the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China will be treated as a commercial in-debt talks, according to the senior finance ministry official. This follows a deal struck with bilateral creditors, including China last week. Zambia, which has been in default for nearly 3 years, reached an agreement to restructure $6.3 billion of bilateral debts, and its international bondholders expect to strike a restructuring deal in the coming weeks. Now, for more on Zambia's debt restructuring, I'm joined live via Skype from Lusaka, Zambia, by Sombo Muzata, Assistant Professor of Political Science at James Madison University and Carnegie African Diaspora Fellow at the University of Pretoria. Sombo, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you so much, Esther. I'm happy to be here.
So what does this debt restructuring mean for Zambia?
Quite exciting, but also concerning. Exciting because for the next few years, say the next 10 years, as has been informed by the Minister of Finance, we're only going to pay $750 million in our debt repayments instead of $5.8 instead of 6.3 billion, which we should have paid, that's the whole amount that has been restructured. So from that point of view, we are freeing up money. Debt servicing money is being freed up because we could have been servicing this debt over the next few years. So it means that the country has a breathing space. And with that breathing space, what does it mean? It means that we can get more investment in the country. It also means that, we can see our currency strengthening up, and also with the investment, hopefully more jobs are created and reduction in poverty. So what this also means, this is on the part of immediate implications. But what this also means, it means that instead of paying at higher rates, for which these debts were contracted, we're going to pay interest rates at 2.5% concessional rates. That's according to the minister's statement. And then also the maturity has been extended by more than 12 years. So this is really exciting news, but then it is also concerning news because the debt has not been written off. It has barely been restructured. And that is understandable because we cannot keep demanding and asking for debt write-offs. Debt is business. So which business would survive if every time you're asking that we shouldn't pay? No business would survive. So that's the concerning part.
So, Professor, during the IMF World Bank meetings here in Washington, D.C., many African countries requested for debt cancellation or restructuring. Zambia has qualified, and they're wondering, why have they not? What did Zambia do differently to qualify for this?
This is a very interesting one. So the accountant in me is thinking this is a case of first in, first out. Zambia was the first country to default on its debt. So it means that Zambia worked quite a lot within this process to try and negotiate. And that's really, an indication of good leadership by the president, but then more by the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance, the Permanent Secretary, and the entire team there. I think they have worked very hard over the last 3 years to work and ensure that we get to the point where we are at. So I would just say that it's a combination of a number of factors, good leadership, but then also allyship. We have seen Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, standing in and putting forth word that, Zambia needs to get a breather because things were pretty tough here at home.
Professor, thank you very much. We'll see what this impact will have on Zambia's people's pockets. Sambo Muzata is Assistant Professor of Political Science at James Madison University and Carnegie African Diaspora Fellow at the University of Pretoria. The International Committee of the Red Cross said on Thursday it had facilitated the release of 125 Sudanese soldiers held by the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group that has been fighting Sudanese forces since April. The soldiers' release, which occurred on Wednesday, followed a request by the parties to the conflict. ICRC's head of delegation in Sudan, Jean-Christophe Sandos, said the organization stands ready to act as a neutral intermediary for the release of detainees from all sides to the conflict whenever requested. The war between Sudan's army and the RSF has caused a major humanitarian crisis and displaced people, 2.8 million people, of which almost 650,000 have fled to neighboring countries. Zimbabwe opposition lawmaker Job Sikala was found guilty in May of obstruction of justice and is now on trial on additional charges of incitement to commit violence and disorderly conduct. But he's not alone. Rights groups say the charges against Sikala are part of a wider crackdown on the opposition ahead of August 23rd elections. Columbus Mavunga reports from Harare, Zimbabwe.
Even coming to court for trial, Job Sikala, the Zimbabwean opposition activist, arrives alone, unlike other inmates. He is still defiant after more than a year in prison, telling VOA outside the court.
It feels that, they are continuing with their persecution of myself. I've been hardened and I'll continue to fight until justice is obtained.
The 51-year-old opposition politician is facing charges of inciting violence and obstruction of justice by allegedly threatening to avenge the murder of an opposition activist. But Sikala and rights groups disagree. His lawyer, Harrison Komo, explains.
Job Sikala believes very strongly that this incarceration has absolutely nothing to do with the law. It is a politically motivated prosecution, which in this case it has succeeded because he's out of the 2023 contest. And obviously he awaits anything between if there is going to be a by-election or the 2028 election. But his view is very, very clear. They wanted to oust him out of the political contestation for 2023, and they have succeeded.
When asked about Sikala's allegations that the charges are politically motivated, Ziyambe, Zimbabwe's justice minister, denies them. He says President Emmerson Mnangagwa is actually making life better for all PC-loving politicians.
Generally, the laws now allow, within the limits that are required to ensure public order, for people to campaign freely. I do not know anyone who has been barred from campaigning. If anything, His Excellency, whenever he addresses a public gathering, his call is, let's be peaceful in our campaigns.
When Zimbabweans go to polls on August 23, Sikala may only be allowed to vote if he is released on bail or is only fined for his second charge. He will certainly not be a candidate, just like another opposition politician, Jacob Ngaruvuman, who is serving a 36-month sentence at the same maximum security prison as Sikala. Rights groups say both men were simply exercising their freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and that their arrests are part of a growing crackdown against opposition voices and dissent in Zimbabwe. Columbus Mavungam for VOA News, Harare, Zimbabwe.
African leaders and officials of several regional organizations met in Angola to discuss the security crisis in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, plagued by violence from dozens of armed groups. Angolan President João Lourenço hosted the summit. His guests included Gabonese President Ali Bongo, DRC's President Felix Tshisekedi, President Evariste Ndayishimiye of Burundi, Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa, and Azali Assoumani, President of Comoros and the current chairman of the African Union, among other dignitaries. Angola has previously brokered several peace initiatives between Rwanda and DRC.
At this four-party summit, we must therefore intensify our exchanges to actively contribute to finding a solution for a peaceful, secure, and prosperous Congo. And to achieve this, we must put forward appropriate political, diplomatic, and security solutions.
The African Union says it's working with different stakeholders to restore peace and security in the region and silence the guns. In Nigeria, poverty is the main reason many children are not going to school, but there are more efforts to close the gap. Gibson Ebeka reports on one unique economic approach designed to get kids into school.
Patient Joseph is a second-year junior high student at North School for 100 naira a day, which is equal to about $0.25 a day. The chance of her getting education was bleak because of her family's limited income. But now, with the pay-as-you-go tuition option at North School, Joseph can access learning and school essentials for less than $5 per month.
Children like me from low-income family get free books, school uniforms, lunch daily, and the girls get sanitary pads monthly. I learned new things. I learned how to speak in public. I even improved in my mathematics.
Joseph isn't the only one who is excited. Many parents, although still struggling to pay, get a discount and the chance to keep their children in school.
She said that this one is helpful more than other schools that I would want them to go. To get that 100 naira, we found it a little bit difficult. But to God be the glory, being that is the cheapest way of enrolling our child to school. We be delighted to pay it, to pay it.
Kingsley Bangwell and his wife launched this law school in 2019. A response to increase in the number of children dropping out of school, the Bangwells developed a flexible and affordable tuition option for children from poor homes. Students pay less than 10% of $150 tuition per term, while sponsors and partners donate the rest, Bangwell says.
Families that, have limited resource, the priority will be food, medicine, shelter, and just basic living. And so what that means is that education and sending their children to school will be relegated at the background.
The number of out-of-school children in Nigeria as of 2022 stood at 18.5 million. According to an international charity Save the Children, with over 40% of Nigeria's 200 million populations living below the poverty line, many households cannot afford school fees. James Rotimi, an education expert, says the government should close the gaps in Nigeria's education sector.
A lot of rural schools don't even have roof over their head. No electricity, no lab, in fact, funding of education is grossly inadequate, and it's a big challenge. Apart from that, manpower. We must be intentional about funding teachers' training and continuous training.
With over 100 students enrolled, North School hopes to expand and take more requests. While inadequate funding has hampered progress, school authorities say they are looking forward to getting more sponsors to join their cause. Gibson Emeka for VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
Still to come, U.S. President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken say Saturday's armed rebellion in Russia shows that President Vladimir Putin is losing the war in Ukraine. We'll be right back.
It is said that laughter is good for the soul, but comedy also sheds light on everyday life concerns that impact our communities. And women comedians are using laughter as a form of expression and empowerment. This week on Our Voices, we take a look at African female stand-up comedians who are making their mark in this genre of entertainment while also advocating for what they believe makes our society a better place. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other African news, Tunisia faces a full-blown crisis in public finances that could destabilize the country with knock-on effects around the central Mediterranean region. European countries offered about 1 billion euros in aid to try to get Tunisia to agree to an International Monetary Fund program, but the offer was meant to be finalized before Thursday's European Council meeting and remains unfinished. South Africa's consumer confidence fell further in the second quarter, according to a survey released on Thursday, as the country struggles with soaring fuel, food prices, and higher interest rates. The Consumer Confidence Index, sponsored by the First National Bank and compiled by the Bureau for Economic Research, fell to a reading of -25 points from -23 points in the first quarter of 2023. And Kenya's first low-cost airline, Jambo Jet, is leasing used planes as it seeks savings in the face of severe cost pressures from a weaker local currency and higher fuel prices. Its chief executive, Karanja Ndegwa, says the Kenya Airways-owned no-frills carrier is set to receive its 8th de Havilland -8400 plane next month, followed by the potential delivery of a 9th in the first quarter of next year. More than 100 Kenyan traders are suing the government, saying that Chinese-owned businesses are illegally undercutting their prices. In March, the traders protested outside a large Chinese shop called China Square. However, many Kenyan consumers welcome the competitive prices. Victoria Munga has more from Nairobi.
Christine Ndungu's shop sells Chinese-made clothes, towels, and other goods. For years, business was brisk, but Ndungu says she began to lose customers after Chinese immigrants moved in and opened businesses that offer lower prices.
You'd be seated in your shop, running your business as usual, and then you'd see Chinese people coming around with samples and telling you that we are selling this product in this market. So, as a business person, as an importer, what has that done to you? You have been undercut from the chain, from the business chain process.
Scores of traders like Ndungu depended on this market, popularly known as Kamukunji, for their livelihoods, but many have been forced out of work. The local Traders Association, under a group called Indigenous Capital Protection, says Kenyan traders are selling and buying less.
To see one container of goods being off-roaded in Kamukunji, it will take a week or 2 weeks. And before this problem start getting worse, we were off-roading 5 or 10 containers in a week.
Kenyan importers say businesses owned by Chinese nationals have an unfair advantage because they're exempted from paying some import duties and can offer lower prices. Consequently, traders are suing the Kenyan government, claiming the state has failed to protect them from what they call unfair competition. The traders want the government to stop issuing employment and business permits to Chinese nationals.
The Chinese cannot in any way be the people who you manufacture in China and also come and distribute in Kenya and also engage in trading and hawking of the same goods. This is what we are saying also requires to be stopped under the law.
The Kenyan government has yet to respond to the lawsuit, which was filed in May. Meanwhile, some consumers say they enjoy shopping at China Square.
I like that everything is under one roof. It makes things a lot easier. You don't need to move around from one place to the other. Plus, the prices are very convenient and affordable for the style that they have.
Kenya's Investment Promotion Act, enacted in 2004, requires that a foreigner's investment must be beneficial to the country through provisions such as new jobs, transfer of skills, and use of local material or services. Victoria Amunga for VOA News, Nairobi.
U.S. President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken say Saturday's rebellion in Russia shows that President Vladimir Putin is clearly losing the war in Ukraine and highlights the stark contrast between Putin's grand ambitions when he started the war and where his army stands now. VOA's diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain has more.
The United States has been cautious in its response to events in Russia Saturday when the Wagner mercenary group took control of key military sites and headed toward Moscow to oust Russia's top military leaders until its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, abruptly called off the mutiny. President Joe Biden said although it was too early to tell how much Russian President Vladimir Putin had been weakened by the armed rebellion, he is clearly losing the war in Ukraine.
He's losing the war at home, and he has become a bit of a pariah around the world. And it's not just NATO, it's not just the European Union, it's Japan, it's 40 nations.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken agreed, pointing to the stark contrast between Putin's ambitions when he started the war and where he finds himself today.
It is genuinely extraordinary that we've gone from a place where we were 16 months ago, where you had Russian forces on the outskirts of Kyiv, to a place where we were this weekend, where you had forces moving on Russia's capital, Moscow, mercenaries of Putin's own making. That, in a way, encapsulates the extent to which this aggression against Ukraine has been a failure across the board for Putin.
One analyst told VOA that Putin is now trying to project strength because he knows Prigozhin undermined his authority.
And demonstrated how hollow some of the government structures are because there weren't significant military resistance to what Prigozhin was doing, more in the sense of people putting their hands up and just letting it happen to a degree.
Ashby agreed with Biden and Blinken that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has dealt a blow to Russia.
It's been a strategic disaster for the Russian state, the Russian government. It has essentially destroyed the future of a whole generation of Russians, not only those who have died in this pointless and senseless war against the Ukrainians, but also those who have left the country, those who are going to be hindered by the sanctions.
Prigozhin arrived in Belarus on Tuesday at the invitation of President Alexander Lukashenko, a Putin ally who claimed that he had to talk the Russian leader out of killing Prigozhin in retribution for the Wagner Group's advance on Moscow last Saturday. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
A Somali American who came to the U.S. as a refugee is now helping chart the future of her state as an elected representative. Mahmoud Muscade sat down with Hodan Hassan for an interview in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in this story narrated by Salem Solomon.
Like thousands of others during the start of Somalia's civil war in 1991, Hoda Hassan fled her home country and sought safety in neighboring Kenya's Dadaab refugee camp. Although she was away from the fighting, dangers persisted.
I was a little kid, but I remember refugee being a really, really hard life, where you have no safety, no security, you have no control over your life, and your food and your income comes from the UNHCR and the monthly rations that they provide. There are no jobs, at the time, there was no school.
She immigrated to the U.S. more than 20 years ago, ultimately settling in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she earned a master's degree in social work and public health and began a career as a mental health practitioner and educator.
America gave my family and myself a chance to get education, a chance to design our life and destiny and plan our future plans, because of America is the reason why I am a state legislator today, because we had a chance to go to school, we had a chance to work hard, we had a chance to rebuild our life.
In 2018, she ran for state representative in her district south of downtown Minneapolis. Now in her third term, she has found that she can make a difference in the lives of newly arriving immigrants through legislation.
I am the chair of Workforce and Economic Development, and one of the things that we passed was a program that supports Ukrainian refugees, Afghanistani refugees, people who are coming to the state of Minnesota to help them, resettle, find a job, get training if they need, learn English.
Hassan believes her stories prove that America is still the land of opportunity. For Mahmoud Musade in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Salem Solomon, VOA News.
Thank you, viewers, for joining us on Africa 54. See you back right here.